Hello, everybody. My name is Adolfo Suarez. I am a partner of Lombardy 22. First of all, thank you for being here. We're still in the virtual space, but I think we are somehow nearer than in the first edition of this, the city we have in mind. If you remember, the 7th of May, we start with this first round of thoughts about the city we have in mind. Lombardy 22 will continue to focus on research, and I think that we have today a great panel. I must thank Davide Ruzzon to put together this excellent panel of excellent thoughts, thinkers of our time. And a special thanks also to Richard Sennett just to join us. And I will let Davide Ruzzon to introduce what is the, let's say, the meaning and the questions that I think all the panelists are going to ask. They are going to show his thoughts from that. The climate from the other session, I think that has changed slightly from the first shutdown on the 7th of May. I think we are trying to open our cities, to open our lives, and I think that it's more important than ever continue to put questions. We are not interested in the answers, but we are interested in the questions that we need to put to try to make a new response to what has happened in all those months that we have left beside us. So, Davide, thank you, and it's up to you.
Grazie Adolfo. Sì, grazie Adolfo per the short introduction. And thanks to Lombardini for the organization, to Lovica, to Valentina, Giacomo, and to the other guys of the team. And now I'm going rapidly to recap in some ways, to summarize the previous part, a very short part of the previous appointment we developed last 7th of May, through which we, for the first time, tried to put together some issues that apparently, and in a wrong way, are completely detached normally, are detached in the awareness of the collective thought. And so we are speaking about the dimension of the nature, the dimension of the virus diffusion, the urban dimension, and the socio-economical dimension. We tried in the last couple of months ago to join the dot in order to find a scenario, say, which we could be able to grasp also the reason for which the virus so easily spread out from the wild, coming and diffusing so rapidly into our urban, very urban cities. David Quammen, with us last time, mentioned some issues that remain now profoundly inscribed in our awareness, I suppose. But now, the reason for which come back and continue in some way the path developed is strictly linked to a very important fact. Almost all the governments, in particular, for what I know, the UA government and also many others, are coming to find, I'm very happy to see also Saskia, a double goal. Well, thanks very much to stay with us. And all the governments are going to put on the table, we could say, a huge amount of money, public money. I'd like to underline public money that for the next generation will remain as a very heavy elements on the shoulders to be for the next generation. So now I want to try to, with your support, to find a way to grasp some components or directions that we could and maybe we should suggest to politicians, to representatives, in order to put the city as a problem inside this great discussion about the capacity to produce a vision of the future inside which rethink the next generations. And so this is the simple reason for which I asked you to support us. Very, very simple. I'm not able by myself to track and to face this big effort. And so I think that entrenching and entwining several disciplines, several ways to see the same object, maybe we can underpin in a very strong way proposals that we could imagine that in some way making, using our imagination, we can put forward toward a more important tables, more important than ours. Not important is a wrong word, more effective, I would say, more effective than ours, to support some shift that we need, because we don't want to come back. This is the topic we underlined in the first. We don't want to come back as never happened in this moment. It is the way, it is the moment to shift a little bit, creating a new scenario inside which to reconcile in some ways detached things, detached science too much time. I conclude here and I introduce now Colin. He's the chair. He's the chair of the first and the second round. And Colin is a neuroscientist, psychologist and neuroscientist from the Waterloo University. He is the founder and the director of the Urban Realities Lab in Waterloo, the Waterloo University in Toronto. And he's, I think, a person that is since a long period trying to create a good base, a good plan on which put together science and humanities. And I think thanks a lot, Colin, for this effort, for the support that is giving us. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, David, for that introduction. I'm just finding out now that I'm the chair of the first and second part of the program. Kidding, I kind of knew. It's my great honor to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Richard Sennett. I could spend a long time giving you an introduction, but I'll keep the introduction short, and I'll try not to gush. Professor Sennett has been widely influential on the sociology of cities for quite a long time through his work at the London School of Economics, New York University, Columbia University, and MIT. He's published prolifically. Of recent note is his book, Building and Dwelling, which looks backwards, which we'll talk about a little bit today, which formed the third part of a trilogy of books, beginning with The Craftsman and then Together. He has an armful of notable awards, including the Hegel Prize, the Spinoza Prize, an honorary doctorate from Cambridge University, and an OBE. So welcome, Professor Sennett, and thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm sorry I can, since I retired, I went to work for the United Nations, and all that happens in the United Nations is people meet. So I'm in the middle of another Zoom meeting, but I'm really glad to talk to you for a while about
thank you.
About cities.
Thank you. We're very happy to have even a little piece of you today. So I just finished Building and Dwelling, and I won't claim to have read all of your books, but it's not the first of your books that I've read.
Shame.
And I know I'm working on it. I'm catching up. I think the book is fascinating and also quite timely in the time of COVID. And what I'd like to do is to just ask you a couple of general questions about the book, and then some slightly more specific questions about its potential relevance to the pandemic. So beginning first of all with the overall theme of the book, the building and the dwelling part is a distinction that you draw between what you call the ville and the cité. I wonder if, I know essentially this is the whole book, but I wonder if there's a way for you to boil down the importance of that distinction and the relationship between ville and cité as you describe it in the book.
Wow. Well, it's a distinction between the physical environment and the way people inhabit the physical environment. A ville is the traditionally it referred to ways of building, and the cité referred to ways of living. What I try to do in this book is counter a cliche which simplifies this relationship by saying that we should build cities according to the way people live. And that's become a kind of cliche of a certain kind of urbanism, which I think misses the fact that a lot of the ways in which people live are quite destructive. You don't want to build a gated community, although that's the most, popular form of housing in the world today. And I just feel, particularly in my generation of urbanists, that somehow we lost as planners the nerve to say, this is what's right and this is what we're going to do. And we became kind of servants of the cité. And there's a side of this in which, of course, rather than imposing a way of life on people the way, say, housing projects do that, we don't want to do that. But the other side of that is that as urbanists, as planners, we want to define what cities should be like and argue for people to live in those kinds of cities. So that's what this distinction is. I'm trying to get away, this is a more complex relationship than building what people want.
Great, thank you. I think for a great deal of your career, including this book, but for long before this, you've been an advocate of complexity and openness in cities. And one of the quotes that I pulled from Building and Dwelling is that you said that urbanism's problem has been a self-destructive emphasis on order and control. And I think you've argued that those things working together, complexity and an openness, can be responsible for generating what you call friction or resistance. I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit, explain to us what you mean by
Can't you ask me simpler questions?
Pardon?
Can't you ask me simple questions? Like, do you believe X or Y? Well, I'll try briefly. I didn't know it when I began writing about the sociology of cities that I was an open systems theorist. I didn't know that until I wound up at the end of my career at MIT. And what I found by working with people there was that open systems theories are about the way in which we generate complexity, difference, friction, noise, and that these complications are all valuable in building up an electronic environment. And it just seemed to me there was an analog between building up that kind of complex open system electronic environment and building building a city, building a physical environment. I mean, cities, they have agglomeration effects, you know, by concentrating differences where people compete and cooperate in the same measure, bring together lots of people who are economically, racially different, and they physically should bring them together. The whole notion about an open city, as I see it, is it's about a place which doesn't have a pre-existing order, a ruling order that assigns where people should live, what they should do, and so on. And that people have to struggle with each other, which is a very messy process, often full of failure, in order to find a better way to live together. So that's, as I say, I only discovered I was an open systems theorist, you know, just about when I was ready to retire. But that's what this idea of the open city is about. It's about the fact that complexity is a kind of stimulation which enables creation. And in terms of where I ended up at MIT, it made me a critic of a certain kind of smart city, which is a top-down imposition of what people should be doing almost minute by minute in order to save energy, to make the city a kind of homeostatic system. And I think looking to the future, that we have to be smart in a different way. We have to be smart the way open systems theorists are, rather than the kind of models we have which are simplifying systems. So that's what that's about.
Great. That leads me to, I guess, a pandemic-related question about technology. I was going to ask you about that because the chapter in Building and Dwelling where you address technology, and as you've just described, the simplistic version of the smart city, which tends to close cities. I'm wondering whether you see, because I'm sure that we're on the brink. In fact, it's already beginning to happen, that we're talking about the uses of technology to help us manage life in the pandemic. Can you, so I think there's this risk that we'll be tempted into sort of closed, simplistic city technologies. Can you suggest any positive uses of technology that might relate to the pandemic crisis?
Well, it is a really good question. The work that I and my team are doing right now at the UN is focused on cities which are very resource poor vis-a-vis the pandemic. Cities in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa, which don't have huge hospital systems and so on. And what we're finding is that some kind of uses of short scale networks done over telephones and whatnot are ways for people who don't have access to the kinds of resources we have here to cope with each other. For instance, if you set up a short-term, a short-link chat network, that if, say, Mrs. Suarez is fallen sick, that her neighbors know that, and they'll leave food outside her door, or speak to her through the door 2 or 3 times a day. It's not high tech, but it's a social use of tech, which for us is really important, and particularly so because this first flush, particularly in Latin America, has pretty much exhausted the resources of the neoliberal state. The welfare state safety net is very thin and very torn, and it's pretty much those resources have been used up by now. So what people have left is an attempt to deal with pandemic conditions, particularly in cities, by inventing these short stem social networks online. And so I think that that kind of tech really plays an important role. Can I say something about this pandemic? As I think what worries me about it in terms of planning.
Please do.
I'm worried, just as you say, that the long-term effects of generalizing long-term from the crisis we're in now are going to mean that we close down cities by doing forms of social distancing and forms of isolation, which are we're generalizing from the crisis condition we're in now to something that where we build more isolated cities, and that would be a terrible thing if we do that. And what my team is trying to do is figure out ways of reconfiguring density and patterns of density and use of public transport and streets and things like street pedestrian traffic, so that there's a way to keep the city more open and more elastic. It would be a terrible thing if we do have a vaccine within a year, to have built cities that were long-term really isolated because we generalized from this pandemic condition after the pandemic had passed. So I think that's a big challenge for urbanists, which is how to think about a ways of dealing with density, which is the heart of this problem, in ways that don't defeat its virtues and its good uses out of fear that we have to permanently isolate from each other. And it's got another side for us, because density is a key to squaring the circle between climate change and health. That is, long-term, for climate change, we have to make cities denser. We've got to reduce the scale of them, but density is a key to the efficient use of resources. And we need to experiment with how to combine that kind of goal, I think, with a kind of more elastic way of dealing with density during the pandemic.
That's very interesting. I think you're absolutely right that we're all so focused at the moment on the public health impact of the virus itself that we're not really confronting the wider public health impact, the mental public health impact of everything that we're doing to us, and social. Yeah. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Do you have time for one last question?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, a very sort of general.
Every UN meeting is endless. So
okay. So the point of all of us getting together today is that we were assigned the task of coming up with a set of themes that might relate to key features of a post or peri-COVID city. And to some extent, you've already addressed that on your answers to my questions. But do you have any signposts to offer us? What would your themes look like?
Well, density obviously would be a very big one. I think one of the issues in this is that the way in which we're dealing with the pandemic at the moment is increasing social and economic inequality. That is, if you pick up the garbage or you're a nurse, you don't have any choice about being in the presence of people who are dangerously ill. But if you're a middle-class person, you can work supposedly from home. You can practice social distancing. And one of the things that really worries me about the way particularly the press thinks about this is that they feature the notion of work, isolated work, as a kind of solution to a problem. It's only a solution for middle-class people. And it's one that I think is going to really widen the already huge gaps in cities of social and economic equality. Working class people don't have any refuge in distance work. So I think one of the signposts for me about this, other than density, is how we don't leave a legacy which has increased inequality in cities. And I think physically that means getting people not to normalize, middle-class people, the notion that they're safe because they're isolated from other human beings. That's a very, very worrying to me.
Thank you. I think that's incredibly important. Thank you for this.
Okay, thank you. I go back to my other meeting, which will go forever. But I hope something comes out of this, and will you keep me informed about what you do?
Sure, yeah.
Yes,
okay.
Please.
Yeah, please do, okay?
Good.
Best to you all. Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Grazie Richard.
Grazie lei.
Okay. So the second phase of our meeting today consists of 5-minute presentations from each of our panelists. And I'm not sure if everybody was here at the very beginning to hear the order of speakers. If not, you'll be surprised. The other note is that we have to be fairly strict with timing. And so you will hear an audible tone at the 4-minute mark, and at the 5-minute mark, I'll ask you to stop so we can move on to the next speaker. And I think everyone has practiced sharing the screen. So with that, I don't see Jagan. Jagan, are you here?
No, Jagan has a problem with the technical problem, and probably will join us later.
Okay.
We'll be able.
All right. So then, Itai, it's up to you.
Well, okay. Hit me by surprise. I'm gonna go with it. So I'm gonna share my screen. Hi, everyone. I'm Iuav. I work at the intersection of architecture and neuroscience through the Conscious Cities movement and through HUME and the Human Metrics Lab. So here's my 5 minutes. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah? Okay. Your skin doesn't separate you from the world. It's a bridge through which the external world flows into you and you flow into it. These are the words of Alan Watts, a British writer who popularized Eastern philosophy to Western audiences. It represents to me the need for society to grasp that we are under a persistent, perceptual illusion of separation between self and surrounding. The illusion, albeit a seemingly comforting one, reduces the complexity of reality to what we believe we can comprehend, and simultaneously robs us of perceiving the interconnected nature of the physical and the metaphysical. The city that helps us overcome this illusion is one that will break the cycle of individualism, one that will illuminate how person, thought, building are all manifestations of the same force, intent. It is through an understanding of intent that we gain a lens into how we shape the city and how, in turn, it shapes us. When we begin to see architecture as living intent, a manifestation of the ideas and actions of its creators, we will be encouraged to rethink the who, what, and why of the built environment. Driven by the illusion of separation, we have used the physical world to impose ownership and power on our surroundings and on one another. But we also see efforts to use design to connect and inspire humanism. When we are able to observe the lack of ourselves in our surroundings because of the way cities are shaped, because of the way decisions are made, then we will ask, whose intent are we living in? And we can also ask, how did we get here? How did the mound of mistakes grow to such a size that we can barely see beyond it? How did we create cities that segregate and isolate, that keep the poor poor and make the rich richer? How did we create cities that have deprived the weak of agency and all of connection and purpose? The city is a reflection of our values, built out of all the micro decisions guided by our culture. We created such cities because they are the primary tool for cementing a chosen reality into being. It is social inertia that blindly drives us, making it difficult to break deep-set habits picked up from our environment, both physical and social. Our own decisions are then guided by that reality, and so on goes the cycle, propelled by its own devices. How do we gather the courage to jump off the bandwagon and take a look from the outside? How much of our identity and behavior is inherited and then passed on? What will we discover that we need to unlearn? The future city should ask us to counter our desire for familiarity with a critical approach that questions it. I don't believe that we can even imagine what a human-centered, healthy, and democratic city looks like. Our own vision and foresight has been blurred and narrowed by all we've learned. But what if we could learn to unlearn? What if we could put into motion a change that begins with the reconsideration of daily decisions, happening everywhere, that collectively navigate us towards the future? To reconsider how we articulate intent, to ask whether architecture is used to answer the needs and desires of those affected, to question if our process is transparent and if we commit to going beyond intuition in our assumptions of how people experience their world. In these decisions that will lead to a future city it's these decisions that will lead to a future city that can reshape the rocky foundations our society perches on. Can we ask what it means to reshape the design professions, to shift our appreciation of good architecture towards the successful representation of shared intent, rather than the God-sent vision of single individuals? Can we imagine what it means to reshape governance through the adoption of processes that value transparency and accountability? Processes that can make governance immune to the tribalism of politics that ripple through our cities in the material and immaterial outcomes of policy? Can we bring to life the dialogue between person and space and use technology for the purpose of communication rather than imposition? Can we become aware of how we reshape ourselves? That's me.
Thank you, Mitai. That was beautifully put, as always. I just noticed that there is at least one question or comment coming in the chat. Hopefully we'll have a chance to address some of the questions in chat in the last part of the webinar today. But for now, we'll carry on with the presentations next with Upali.
All right, can you see my screen, Colin?
Yes.
Now, Itai, that was so inspiring as always. And I'm going to take a couple of ideas that you put out there, hopefully further the concept of unlearning, courage, and the question of individuality. To me, I see this fundamental shift that has been very evident about, especially in the US, the shift from being responsible for my health to actively being responsible for your neighbor's health. And it's been perhaps the biggest concept that we have had struggles with, this idea that I'm not just responsible for my health, but I am responsible for your health and you are responsible for mine. What does that do when we start thinking about our buildings in our cities? The other moment, evolving moment in some ways, is this realization of interdependence. This idea that human-centered and planet-centered thinking is very interdependent. We have craved for outside spaces. We have embraced our balconies, those small thresholds that give me a window of connection to the outside. And this was a comment that isn't really mine. It was made in one of my talks, which I thought was so powerful, that is there a shift? Will 2020 be the year where we shift from human-centered to living-centered? Will we finally have an awareness of not being the center of the universe, but a part of an ecosystem that is shifting and that we are forced to shift in so many ways? Will the sustainability conversation not happen in this complete silo, but really be part of my daily conversation? And this concept of interdependence and that shift from individualism is a key component of how we envision our cities. The other idea that has really been going almost in a loop through my head is on how we are moving in a world that is hybrid, and we have to embrace it. We have to understand that every footprint has a cloud print. There is a presence that I have right now where I'm living in an Ann Arbor, but talking to Rome all over the place. What does it mean to really understand what's the synthetic of the hybrid? What do I have to embrace and what do I have to be aware of or conscious of? Because this is new, this idea of footprints and cloud prints, and this easy escape that we've had into a cloud print. What does it really mean for my embodied existence? And finally, which is I think a theme for everyone who's on this talk, is understanding consciousness, this interdependence between body and brain, and being really hyper-conscious of this period that we are in. So we don't necessarily go back because that would be a shame, but we don't react in the way we go forward. And when we think about the city, for me, it's always been fascinating to think about the mind as a city. The mind is a city that we must understand and navigate. Human behavior during this pandemic has been a huge mystery. But if we understand it, perhaps we can navigate a better society. So it's about the mind in the city, but also the city in the mind that we need to truly understand and navigate. And because I'm a pracademic, because I sit in practice as a director of research for HKS, which is an architectural firm, and also teach as an academic at the University of Michigan, a lot of this for us has culminated in what would that look like? What would an attempt at that look like if we were to make it a reality? And a large team of us worked on a concept, almost a conceptual framework of sorts, where you think about an agile design, which is not fragile because it's agile, which builds community. And that means you have to be net positive for not just environmental health, but social health. That means that health and education actually are interdependent and work together. It means we have intergenerational dependence. One of the things we've learned recently is this idea of a strengths-based perspective. What if we assume that everybody in society and in communities has something to offer that is their strength, and that we really are able to draw from each other? And what does it mean instead of thinking about buildings as firm capital assets? Rather, they are flexible and mobile frameworks that allow us to shift. And in that vision of a community block, an agile design is something that builds actively community. and the community creates resilience. And in that way of thinking, perhaps when we close off, we always understand that we're closing temporarily to protect and provide better for other areas that can open, that you're breathing and flexing and moving, because cities are living, breathing organisms. And we know that the biggest risk we've had today is that of breath. It's how we breathe as individuals, how our buildings breathe, and how our cities breathe. And that, I think, is an ongoing investigation for us that can we really envision a community-based ecosystem that, because it supports life continuity, supports business continuity, and that they are not in conflict with each other. So it's a concept, it's a way of thinking, but I think it's really comes back to thinking in a very interdependent ecosystem. And is a prompt for conversation. Thank you. Did I make it in time, Colin?
I became so enthralled by your words, Poli, that I forgot to look at the clock, but I didn't hear a tone saying you've gone overtime. I love, by the way, your self-designation as a pracademic. I've never heard that before. The world needs more pracademics. Thank you for doing what you do. The next speaker on my list is Elizabeth Merrick. Do I see? Yes, there you are, Elizabeth.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see my picture?
We can't see your slides. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
No.
Now?
No. That looks promising. There we go.
Oh, now you can see it?
Now we're good.
Okay, I start to talk. You can see my slides, I hope. I'm sorry.
We can see your desktop, Elizabeth, but we can't see a slideshow.
Okay, anyway, I will start without my slides if this is not possible. I don't know. I see it on 3 screens.
Oh dear.
Hier. Neue Freigabe.
Genau, dann auf Bildschirm 2, glaube ich. Genau, dann teilen.
Okay, I start to talk. My first.
Now we see it.
You
now
can see it?
Yep.
Okay, sorry for this interruption. So my first point is how a cycle of growth needs also cycles of innovation, and how can we get a chance out of the high dynamic transformation, and what is the half-life of projects and governance today, and is the city open for different time layers of density, because I really think that innovations need time strategies and spatial solutions. My second point is the public space. For Munich, we have a new master plan based on a multi-layered public space concept. And the precondition is a new understanding for mobility and the user perspective. And so the emotional qualities of the city became very important for us. So one question is, what can add a good architecture to a place? Does architecture really matter? And how will this place feel? And who is the one who can make decisions which affect the places? I think this really should be part of participation and citizens. My third point, wie macht man das weiter? Nach oben oder unten? The third point is like the community block, it's about neighborhoods. And we could experience in our city that during the Corona crisis, that the habit changed in our neighborhood. So formerly vivid places were empty, but formerly empty corners get a new street credibility. And we start to discuss about how should these places welcome different communities, how should they welcome a different type of social interaction. And our city is a mixed diversity, and so it's plenty of different identities. And one very important point for my city for the future is about social justice and solidarity among different groups in society. This is what we call citizens and a democratical experience in our neighborhoods. Special kind of social interaction and somehow appropriation, which leads then to, how to say, overwhelm disparities. So also sharing of resources of space in our cities. And the last point is what I like to call a cultural Green Deal. So it's not only about technical issues about reduce of CO2 emissions or landscape qualities. So it's really about a cultural approach, how to deal with climate change and how to deal with a different idea of sharing the resources of the city and also of the good life in the city. So that's what I wanted to contribute. And now I'm not sure if you have seen my slides. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. We saw your slides. Thank you very much. Alessandro, are you? I'm having a hard time seeing who's here now, but Elizabeth, could you turn off your slide share, your screen share, please? There we go. Alessandro, over to you.
Yes. I'm opening the presentation, so I'm going to open directly to Facebook like previous test. Okay. Okay, can you see my presentation? My colleague, is it okay?
Yes, yes, it looks good.
Perfect. So I just take 5 minutes, so I'm sure I'm not going beyond. Okay. So my keywords, let's say some of the aspects have already discussed by the colleague before, so I will try to a little bit by side to my presentation to go to underline some different aspects, just not to repeat some of the aspects, especially about resilient communities that I consider fundamental, pivotal in these moments. So the first keyword that I've selected is creativity. I found fantastic what Richard said about the fact that complexity must be considered a creative opportunity today, and the city represents this complexity. So every time we have tried to simplify the idea of the city and generalize from a trend to an idea, we have made mistakes. So we have to embrace this complexity. I find this approach very interesting, and this is the approach that led me to be more and more interested in transdisciplinary approaches, and this is why I'm particularly happy to be here, because I see, thank you, Colin and David, because you are working very hard in putting, linking the dots of, let's say, cross-disciplinary perspective, which is fundamental. So in my case, transdisciplinarity led me to consider biology of evolution as a key discipline in this context, simply because, let's say, we can, if I can put in extreme terms what Richard said, we could consider the city itself as a wrong trend, possibly.
Sorry, Alessandro, can I interrupt for just a second? I think some people are having a hard time hearing you, so if maybe you could put your microphone a little bit closer.
Okay, I try to. maybe it's better like this.
Say some more words.
Is it better like this?
Sounds better to me, yeah.
Okay, I try to see if the mic, the volume is okay, even if I cannot get out. One second. Just checking if the volume is high enough. Yes, actually yes. So
it's better now.
Okay, I try. Maybe it was the microphone of the cuffs that was not the hair cuffs. Okay, shall I start from where I was? So, what I was trying to say, I was emphasizing the importance of the biology of evolution, because we might consider a perspective of 200,000 years instead of the perspective of 10,000 years, which is the classical perspective of history of architecture, or let's say history of urban planning, as more efficient in this case, especially when we are talking about crisis, environmental crisis, simply because this is the first environmental crisis we are facing in 10,000 years, at least at this dimension, where if we consider the perspective of 200,000 years, we have several crises of this dimension. One of these crises was the one that actually generated the proliferation of creativity in a period between 200,000 years and 90,000 years ago. So we know that, according to the studies done by Eder Pringle, a paleoanthropologist, that creativity let's say, evolved from a specific crisis condition, which led the human brain to be developed in terms of networking in complexity and producing this modality of thinking specifically designed for crisis, which is called associative thinking. I find also this image very interesting because, again, regarding the reification of humans, the idea of building narrative is that we have considered the man as the center of the creativity process and the woman as a collateral representative of the society. Recent studies are telling us that 70% of the hands that you can see here belongs to women. And I find this quite interesting for a series of consequences in terms of evolutionary biology that we could consider. It doesn't go to the second image. Okay, so coming to the second image, again, I find interesting that not only the discussion of the crisis, but also the discussion on design for crisis in the biology of evolution has been developed, and let's say it's part of a discussion that started at least in the 60s, and today is, let's say, it's very, very relevant in their field of research. This is a discussion that led to the formulation of a term which is exaptation. We could say exaptation, if we transfer this term into architecture, we could consider exaptation as a form of undeterministic design, which is actually not existing in the taxonomy of architecture. Of course, we sometimes speak about informal design, but we usually consider informal design as something collateral and something that is probably a consequence of the limitation, or let's say of the mistake of the formal design. In biology of evolution, the alternative of the word exaptation, let's say differently, the exaptation is a complementary to the word adaptation. Adaptation can perfectly fit to the means of deterministic design. So the feathers of the birds are a typical example of exaptation. A fact that something that has been designed for something else can be coated for different use, in this case for flight. What is interesting here is that the capability of our, let's say, the natural selection is as a positive position in the moment in which not it's able to design expected function, but when it's able to provide complexity and what we call spandrel in order to be coopted by functions that cannot be expected. So every time we design for a specific function, we made a mistake. And exaptation seems for me particularly interesting as a design purpose in terms of climate change. And this refers a lot to what Richard said about why we should design for COVID. This is exactly the point. If we design for COVID, we already know for evolutionary biology, this will be a great mistake. First is because we are let's say, building a classic example of reification. So finding a trend in a fluctuation of a system, which is actually a symptom of a bigger context. So to arrive to the next word, which is diversity. According to the biology of evolution,
abbiamo bisogno di concludere, dobbiamo stare nei tempi, mi raccomando.
Sì, I'm almost ready to conclude. In terms of biology of evolution, the diversity is more important than the capability to design expected function. Simply because the subject able to provide diversity to the context is in a way able to increase the number of spandrels, the number of opportunities that can be co-opted. So this means that in a way, when we talk in terms of ecology, it is less relevant the capability to imagine future scenario. It is more important to have a society enough differentiated with the possibility to design from different perspectives, because this is the only chance we have to foresee future scenarios that are more resilient. So in a way, the conclusion is that we should consider informal design as an example of exaptation, but we can consider other examples, not as a collateral negative consequences of the our society, but actually as a place in which we could analyze, for example, phenomena like temporary appropriation of public space as a possibility to represent exaptation, and so to learn a different way to use undeterministic design to overcome crises. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. Next on the list is Susan Maximin.
Hi, everybody. Can you see me? I'm not sure if my screen is actually working.
We can't see a screen share yet, but we can see you.
Hold on one sec. Let's see if I can get this to come up. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let me start here. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this today. Fascinating perspectives and such an important topic. So I thought that I would enter this conversation from a slightly different point of view. In our lab, we're very interested in thinking more deeply about the neurobiology around place, and thinking about sort of how understanding some of that work can really begin to have a place in a larger conversation about what cities look like and what they mean at a very deep human level. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of topics, and then maybe spend 1 or 2 minutes just kind of trying to pull some of that together. So this area around sensation and perception, I think, is really important. We know so much about how we bring the world in from a neurobiological level, and how that really changes us. And as I think Itai so beautifully said in his talk, that we think that we are really sort of separate from the world, but in fact, there's a very porous membrane between us and the world, and every environment really dramatically changes us. And so these sensory inputs are critically important. Obviously, when we think about genetics and conditioning and life experiences, we think about this idea of enriched environment, what that does to our very biology at a cellular level, and also from an epigenetics level. So thinking about perception, so not only how the world comes in, but how we individually perceive how the world comes in based on those other variables that I mentioned. So I feel like this idea around the neurobiology of sensation and better understanding of perception is really important. Secondly, I'd love to spend more time really thinking about the nature of embodied cognition. So we feel long before we think. There's a wonderful quote from Jill Taylor that says, most of us think of ourselves as thinking creatures that feel, but we are actually feeling creatures that think. And I feel like this idea of how we bring the world in and how we feel it, how our nervous system really interprets external stimuli is super important in the spaces that we create and the way we move through space. I think in this area also, when you start to think about place and grid cells and the way that they move us, help us to navigate in the world, but also how when place and grid cells are really engaged and practiced, how that really affects memory and how that helps us in terms of cognitive, higher levels of thinking and cognition. And so embodied cognition is in some ways the mother lode of how we feel space, and being able to tie that to some of the practice around design and architecture and thinking about urbanism is really important. Reward systems, and I will also add both reward and fear. How do we respond to these spaces where we actually do feel good and where we feel afraid and where we feel a sense of peril or lack of protection? And we know that when we do feel reward, and whether that is dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, we are social, we are engaged in the community. When we are feeling stressed and there's a high level of cortisol, we react, we retreat, we often leave or we freeze or we are unable to really be fully engaged. So understanding the natures of this kind of mechanism, I think, is really important. Let me see if I can get to the next slide here. Whoops. There we go. I'll just briefly talk about default mode network. And this is really a shout out also to this idea around who we are as individuals, how we individually see the world, but also thinking about culture and where we come from and how we identify with who we are and what our identity is. And so, every community has its own identity, but every individual also has its own, their own sense of place and personhood. And so in some communities where identity have been stripped, individuals don't know who they are within the world. And so that ties into thinking right now quite a lot around social justice and inequality, but also social change. And so this idea of identity and culture and understanding who we are in a self-referential way, but also as it relates to the world that we live in, is another area of study that I think we could learn a lot from. I'm not going to talk a lot about decision-making, but just to say that, there are two mechanisms at play in decision-making. One is reactive and one is responsive. And so in space, how do we really think about the decisions we make when we're in space, and when are we reacting and when are we responding, and where is, one is conscious and one is unconscious. And so what do we want to be, how do we want to be in a space? And when you think about things like flow and creativity and innovation, that's very much about reflection, not reaction. Finally, implicit bias. A lot of spaces are transcribed and interpreted through implicit bias. And so really understanding what are the mechanisms at play there. And finally, just to kind of bring it home, in thinking more deeply about how do we enhance health and well-being, and I would say amplifying potential, human potential within cities and communities, I think there's a real need to think about the expansion of research, looking at the way that research and practice dance together. So it's not directional. it's bidirectional, and how we can really bring that together, thinking about this idea of how do you create implementation strategies where there is a continuum between research, practice, outcome studies, understanding what's working and what's not working, and making sure that all the players are at the table. So that's the community members, the planners, the designers, the researchers, that it's highly interdisciplinary. I'd love for us to see an innovative metric in terms of a return on investment. So what are we measuring on a return on investment? And I think that comes back to some of the other speakers' talks about who's in control and who's in charge, and who is really writing that narrative and really creating that kind of narrative around a community. And that all should inform new policies in communities, what's important to us and why it's important. And then finally, I think this is really around building a field. There's a lot of conversations that are happening, but how do you build a field that really sustains these conversations and moves the research and the practice forward? So we go from conversation to, I think, more of a complex methodology around how we do this through some more informed lenses of all the disciplines coming together. So let me stop there. Thank you so much, Colin.
Thank you, Susan. That was great. A really interesting and different take on the question. Next up is Harriet.
Sorry, can you see the slide?
Yes, we can see
okay,
them.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Right, okay, so we're here to imagine really what our priorities should be in the post-COVID city, or even the co-COVID city, given how long this politically exacerbated infection period is likely to continue. What I'd like to present are 5 critical contingencies, or what I see to be codependent criteria that really connect what a post-COVID city could look like to potentially what, you know, a post-police city could look like, or a post-racist or post-poverty or even post-zoonotic city could look like, because these things are all profoundly interconnected. So we often hear the term post-Anthropocene, and it's a really intriguing term because it doesn't necessarily mean anything yet, or at least it's fluid enough for us to contest it and tear it apart. But there's something always when we latch the term post onto anything, that it kind of yokes us to some sense of a prior condition. It's packed full of the standard human conceits that we are somehow divorced of our errors, our previous errors and crimes. But in fact, I think we're still very much unable to, if you like, move into this phase. But I also like to see it as a mandate. How do we really start thinking about ending the anthropocentric, so the human-centered exploitation of the planet? And I think when we look at it like that, we start to understand that we're now moving into a period where we understand intersectionality to mean that contingencies against the discrimination against animals is obviously becomes a template for discrimination between humans and not just across species. And so the question becomes, in a post-COVID city, how can we move away from our unrelenting privileging of cities that are principally fit for humans rather than anything else, and start to imagine what our multi-species inhabitation could look like? And that's super interesting when you think about the possibilities typologically for designers. Oops, sorry, trying to find the next button. And decolonization is another contingency. It's obviously come out of the Rhodes Must Fall social movement in South Africa in 2015. And this call to decolonize education, which was the driver for this dialogue, if you like, and education being the engine room of construction futures and professions. This really puts pressure on the architectural humanities to reconstitute its canon, to think more carefully about its content, its methodologies, and its masters, and also consider whose are the voices in the room, who are the voices of authorities. But it creates space for the conversation to expand and to give authority to more peripheral protagonists. And I think this is really where this conversation might go later, hopefully in the Q&A, to start thinking about where is queer urbanism and deep ecological thought situated in relation to this question. I think more generally, the architecture and design disciplines are constrained by a lack of representation, a lack of listening, and a lack of diversification. All of these bleed through into, I would say, the unequal city that we're here to discuss today and confront. Okay, Global South, again, I'm latching onto some what I call serial packet phrases right now. They ignite huge resistance and I would say anxiety in many people, but we start looking at what Global South really means in relation to this topic. And I think it's, you know, an understanding that we have failed collectively to really ensure that we have equitable exchange of knowledge, of materials, of labor across regions. And this is really about understanding that the Northern Hemisphere and the cities in it, and this is particularly North American and European cities of, if you like, allowed imperialism to embed a system of, I would say, hungry city excess, where our demands for energy, our demands for materials, talent migration, affluence, and so on, have perpetuate inequalities that will in many ways disable our abilities to form any kind of meaningful, lasting and universal resistance to the virus. And so this really starts to point towards the idea of a kind of post-humanities. And I think it's an understanding that, you know, we need to move beyond these blinker perspectives about what we think a discipline's obligations are, and start to understand that, you know, if you like, the climate change imperative as being entirely around, and the climate crisis imperative as being what will drive principally many of the changes for, oh, someone's talking and it's a bit distracting. Sorry. Okay, so supply chain slavery. So materiality is key. What are we going to make the new city from? We already know, for example, that the PPE right now is filling the oceans. It's killing fish. It's another environmental crisis on top of the many others we as a species have enacted. So this idea about actually thinking who is supplying the materials needed to form some kind of meaningful resistance against the virus, and also who has access to them. We're not even medics in the US and the UK, for example, have proper PPE. You know, we need to start looking at what, if you like, a democratized materiality could look like, and who is able to access it, but also who is exploited in the production, in its supply. So I think this obviously lends itself to a more broad question about what social justice is. Again, this idea of us coming up with these terminologies, provocations is, you know, these are extremely broad, obviously, but, you know, understanding social inequality to be inscribed in the built environment of cities, that's what cities have been built for. They are in themselves icons of inequality. That's what they serve to do. They were invented to create partitions between, if you like, the rural and the urban, and to create hierarchies within regions and countries and societies and across, if you like, continents that would privilege certain groups over others. The idea of being able to have any kind of conversation about what a post-COVID city could look like without really confronting social justice is just simply impossible, because there is no spatial justice without social justice. And we should remember also that the COVID virus is actually just a proxy for us in a way. It's kind of embedding all our rights right now. It's discriminating in the way that it will punish more poorer communities than it does affluent communities. We're at the mercies of political leadership or a lack thereof in terms of our risk factors. If you like, again, there's a regional bias. It's really, really obvious about how it's discriminating right now, but it's really just carrying out as an agent on our behalf, a kind of, I would say, an illustration of the way that we are not only continuing to harm each other, but harm other species across the planet. And in a way, as it acts out its consequences of inequality, injustice and exploitation now upon us, what we now need to recognize is that its agency, and actually seeing it as an agent of change for us, becomes, I would say, a political and a philosophical, but also a design obligation. So.
Thank you, Harriet. That was provocative, fascinating. Hopefully we can go back to that, as you said, in the Q&A. Sarah Goldhagen.
Okay, just a minute. Okay, are you seeing the first slide?
Looks good. Yep.
Okay, good. Hi, everyone. I have to say, as I'm listening to these presentations, with every presentation, I think to myself, I second that, I second that, I second that. Maybe we should do a manifesto, like CIAM, you know, anyway. So there's so much good material here. And I was a bit flummoxed by the challenge of saying anything meaningful in 5 minutes. And now you've all intimidated me into feeling even more flummoxed. So in any case, if we think about a post-COVID world, I mean, COVID is only one thing. We have climate change. We have the horrifying political situation that we're currently in. Excuse me. I've forced myself in preparation for this morning to think about this as an opportunity. Never waste a good crisis. So how can we not waste this crisis? One thing I think is pretty clear is that with the pandemic, pressure has been put on space as a meaningful category of discussion. We know that living in certain neighborhoods puts you at higher risk for catching what can be this deadly disease. We all have this imperative to social distance, but what does that mean? Social distancing 6 feet, 6 feet is a pretty long way away, as that wonderful video showed you with that guy in the umbrella thing moving down the sidewalk. Most sidewalks don't really allow 6 feet of social distancing. We have to quarantine. That means that we're in one space again and again and again, day after day after day. And so suddenly space and the design of space is on a lot of people's minds. It's always on architects' minds, but I think a lot more people are beginning to realize how critical space is and its design in light of this situation. And so the opportunity that we have, I think, is to reframe how we talk about what it is that architects and landscape architects and urban designers do. And we reframe it in the following way. This is picking up on a bunch of things that many of you have said, which is that we could jettison the language of value. Good design adds value. Susan, you talked about return on investment. Like, how do we talk about return on investment for what we're calling human-centered design or whatever? So we could jettison the language of value completely, which is based in economics, and we move instead. Do you have the next slide now? Everyone? Yes? Okay. We move instead to the language of public health. Because what we have learned is that there is an intermeshed, integral, inevitable relationship between someone's health and quality of life and the design of the spaces that that person has access to and can use, from education to public parks, to neighborhoods, and so on and so forth. And what I'm doing here, this is just a little diagram with all these different public health you'll see is in the middle. The different factors and dimensions in public health. What I'm effectively doing is proposing a concept that I've gotten from Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, who write about international development. They basically say, they argued that when you're talking about the health of a country, it's not enough to simply use metrics around physical health, like mortality, infant mortality or maternal mortality, or shortened lifespans from pollution, or all these things that public health officials talk about all the time. That's not enough, argue Nussbaum and Sen. They basically argue that what you need to do is measure also how much a society fosters what they call human capabilities. That people have a fundamental right to live in environments that don't harm them, that don't have toxic waste, that et cetera, that don't have COVID running everywhere and killing at least elderly people and lots of other people. But people also have a right to live in a society, in a country, in a polity that allows them to foster their own capabilities. And this is Martha Nussbaum. So you need life, number one, and the preservation of life. You need bodily health, number two. You need bodily integrity. You need stimulation for your senses, for your imaginations, for your thoughts. You need stimulation and the fostering of the right kinds of emotions and so on, of self-consciousness and self-awareness and so on. So, okay, how does this relate? How does this change what we do? It takes it away from it takes design of any sort away from the language of this would be nice to the language of it's essential. And some of this progress has already been made. I mean, we now have laws that mandate non-toxic materials, that mandate a certain kind of ventilation, that some countries have laws that talk about that mandate good daylight for office environments, and so on and so forth. So, but what I'm saying is, over and above those basics, which relate to physical health, there are some less obvious things that are aesthetic, that relate to the nurturing and fostering of human capabilities. And so here on the screen, just as one example, I was trying to think of a quick example of this. Adolfo van Eyck, a post-war architect in the Netherlands, for the city of Amsterdam after World War II, built around 700 playgrounds in interstitial and leftover spaces all throughout Amsterdam. And many of them are still there. Some of them are not. Very simple. The bottom one you can see, it's just basically a paint job and a concrete circle. I mean, we're not going to go through. But I think that one thing that we've learned from quarantining, from the differential impact of COVID-19 in these things, is the importance of locality and place, and creating a sense of locality and place. We've learned, certainly politically, about the fragility of our political institutions. Don't get me going. And all of this means that it's up to us as designers, architects, landscape architects, and so on, to really reinforce a sense of locality and place wherever we're going. And that's an aesthetic issue as much as it is anything else. And in order to do that, we need to follow up on some of the things that Susan was talking about, which is deal with what we know about how people appropriate, apprehend, and remember, and have remember places and have meaningful experiences within them. And for that, you need a certain set of aesthetic tools, like multisensory design is critical. No more privileging just the visual and the sort of iconic part of it. Sequential opportunities over time for surprise, for wonder, for mystery, to have these kinds of meaningful experiences that are specifically connected to a neighborhood and a place.
Sarah,
yeah, am I finished?
Yeah, you're a bit over, so I'm gonna have to ask you to wind up.
Okay, no problem. Metacognition, that's it. Places that promote metacognition is the last one. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Next up, Jeanji.
Okay, I'm here. Only one moment. Can you see?
Looks good.
Yep. Yes. Okay. So I like to thank Davide for this invitation and all of you for this great seminar. So the city I have in mind is the one we live in. and is a city that is ugly, dirty, nasty, and unsustainable. The humans I have in mind, who are ugly, dirty, nasty, and unsustainable, should be different. The city, which is our second best invention, which is our nest, and our ecological niche is our product. And it will never be beautiful, clean, nice, and sustainable until we change. For us, the humans, changing our habits is a very complicated game because the purposive thinking, as Gregory Bateson taught us, thanks to his great book, Steps to an Ecology of Mind, in 1972, he was explaining to us that we are self-corrective systems against internal disturbances. And we usually forgot these aspects. For this reason, before thinking about how to change the city, how to improve the quality of life in the city, the environment, we should think about how to change the way we think and act. And we should ecologize our thought before thinking about how to ecologize the city. We must, and not we should, but I think we must leave and abandon some bad words, some ugly, dirty, and nasty concepts. For instance, growth, you know, until the limits to growth, etc., 1972. Efficiency, that is a very bad and very contaminating word. Competitiveness, that is a disaster, and prosperity, also prosperity is a bad word. These words are contaminating our minds and our souls. We have to change the language to correct and change our thinking and action. Language is our first best invention. The city is the second best invention of humans, but language is the first one. And everything comes from the language. Everything comes from the way in which we are speaking, from God to the periodic table of the elements. And I think that we have to clean and ecologize our minds and our thought, and we should learn something from the Aboriginal Dreamtime and song lines, debunking the Western hubris against nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Genji. Next is me.
I have to leave.
You have to unshare.
But yeah, how? Okay, it's good.
We still see your screen. I'll see what happens. Oh, yeah, here we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. We're running seriously behind, which is entirely my fault. I keep becoming so enraptured by people's words that I forget to check and look up. So my presentation is actually pretty concrete, so I'm going to fly through it fairly quickly just to make sure that there's some time for discussion. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about, for those of you who might not know what this is, it's a popular children's toy called maybe not just children, called a transformer, which is a kind of a mechanical device that is exciting because it can change from one form to another. And the reason that I put it here is just to emphasize one of the things that I think is blocking us from thinking about how to move forward in the built world in times of a pandemic. And that is the idea of the monofunctional building. So the best example that I can think of is what's happening right now in education, both locally for me and I know over the wider world. We seem to be stuck on this problem of how to continue safely having children come into schools. And the problem, as I see it, is that we have to redefine what a school is. It's not the building, it's the system. And schools can be anywhere if we think about what buildings are a little bit differently. Here's a really simple example, and this is my second principle, which is inside out. I think that we, at this point, know that generally we're safer outdoors than we are indoors. And I think we have to think more broadly about what kinds of settings what kinds of outdoor settings can be used for the functions of life. So this is a really simple example of a very modest outdoor classroom. Lots of schools have a modest outdoor classroom. I think that idea could be expanded vastly to have much more of the school be out in the world outside, and not just schools, but other kinds of buildings as well. New hybrids, I've got a couple of examples here. One is more elaborate, the BMW Guggenheim lab that I worked in for a few iterations in different cities. And as you can see, it's an outdoor setting, but it's a hybrid setting in which there are many different kinds of functions that can take place in the setting, from exhibition to meetings and so on and so forth. The bottom part of the slide shows a project. This was actually a student project at Montgomery College, something called Outbox. And the idea was to have pop-up office spaces that were somewhat enclosed, but largely open in Silver Springs, Maryland. And they were hugely popular while they went on. And again, an example of how thinking outside the box, pardon the lame play on words, might allow us to move things in safer outdoor settings that are ordinarily thought of as being indoor settings. We've talked a little bit about equity. I think this is incredibly important. I think, you know, one of the things that's happened with the pandemic is that it's been this enormous stress test. So things that we already knew weren't working very well, we now understand are critically not working very well. And equity is certainly one of them. If you look at where people are suffering, catching the virus more commonly, then there are huge inequalities in urban environments. And this slide just shows a couple of examples of measures of spatial equity, one from a more academic source with the city of Munich, and one from a civic source in the city of Vancouver. And both of them are meant to highlight the fact that in different parts of a city, as we all already know, we have different amounts of access to all kinds of spatial amenities. These have to do more with access to green space, but there are all other kinds of other inequities as well. And then finally, just finishing with this, I'm really interested in finding ways to promote and maintain vitality in cities. And I think that kind of plays into some of the other things that I've talked about. Especially for places that don't have access to finely crafted green spaces, for example. Right now, there's lots that we can do to encourage vital civic neighborhood spaces. This is an example of a civic project in the city of Edinburgh called the Big Lunch, where people can basically apply for a little bit of funding to hold an event on their street. And this is an example of such an event. Obviously, it's pre-COVID because people aren't distancing, but events like this with a little bit of money, a little bit of support could easily help to promote vitality in a peri or post-COVID city. I'll stop there and pass the baton to Yves.
Mute. Okay, hopefully you can hear me, and I will try to share screen. Okay, please let me know if you can see my screen.
Looks good.
Okay, great, thank you. And thanks to everyone again, Davide and Colin and the entire organizing committee. This has been such an inspired conference. I really appreciate it. What I wanted to talk about was how we are actually using and can continue to use the neuroscience of how our brains, minds, and bodies interact with our built settings to determine our behavior. And I think right now, more than almost anywhere in the world, the US is suffering from an inability to convey a language that helps people to understand how we interact in space in order to conquer the coronavirus. And so whereas neuroscience and architecture may seem very ethereal, and I've enjoyed so many of the presentations about our innate desire for design and our instinct and intuition for design, we can measure and use those measures to guide how we design and how we behave in design. And so the approach I take here is to look at not only our physiology, which is quite measurable and relates to our senses, but also our psychology that relates to our perception, our cognition, and then our creativity. But what I think is most important in these times is also to add the clinical perspective. And I only learned a few years ago when I started merging architecture and neuroscience with healthcare design that the history of clinicians speaking to scientists was such that these disciplines were divided. And so it's no surprise that urban planning, urban design, and public health have been divided. And the point is that we have to bring the clinical realities into our considerations now. And I'm just going to mention two things as it pertains to health that I think is rather important. This concept of asymptomatic patients and the aerosolization of this virus. And this really drives how we should be thinking and talking and thinking about design for not only inside, but also outside. And so the concept of this 6 feet, no problem, you only have to worry about inside, it actually belies what we've all learned since childhood, that we spread flus and respiratory viruses by sneezing and touching and being too close to each other. And it's amazing to me that we've forgotten this. But working with clinicians, we've actually developed a new guidance to help them to think about not just what we think might be happening, but the 239 scientists who sent, and doctors, medical doctors, who sent a letter to the WHO about the likelihood of aerosolization. And once we recognize that this can be circulated within our buildings, then we have to ask questions about how it moves outside of our buildings. And I heard reference to this wonderful experiment by the gentleman who created a 6-foot hula hoop around himself and tried to walk down the streets of Toronto. And he certainly couldn't go near anybody on a sidewalk, and he certainly couldn't fit through the scaffolding around a newly constructed building. And so we really need to think about our cities in this way. And when we try to divide space, we really need to think about our perception of distance, because this is what we're actually rather bad at. And at the same time, with this beautiful illustration of a cough, we need to think about the fact that these virus particles are sticky and they're picked up in either droplets or aerosols, and that's just a matter of dimension, and dispersed not only by the cough, not only by the doctor trying to resuscitate a patient and pressing on their heart and lungs, or trying to intubate and therefore filling the room, but wind and air. So how do we design spaces so that we change our brains? We know that our brains change with exposure and experience. We can measure our perception of space. So here we're inside of a virtual reality simulation that's full scale relative to the person perceiving and showing the part of the brain is lighting up, that gives us a sense of place and space. And we know that this network of the vestibular system with the visual system and the parietal system actually tells us where we fit within space. And we know the brain is plastic. The vestibular system is actually one of the most plastic systems. And so we can retrain our brain and our thinking to guide our design changes. And I think this is one of the best illustrations of how to do this. Inside and out, I've noticed as I've looked at realistic cues, insides of buildings and insides of cities, this is the type of thing that can help us to retrain our brains. So here we see not only our distances, our circles for communities that are in the same bubbles, but also that they are dispersed and people very happily adopting these. And I feel our opportunity is to take science, work together with the scientists and clinicians who are so thrilled and delighted to join into the conversations. We are just releasing now our COVID-19 frontline report, which is a new set of guidance for healthcare facilities. But the beautiful thing about neuroscience and architecture is whatever we learn about a human being, whether it's through anthropology or psychology or physiology or medicine, it applies to all people in all places. And so working with this frontline task force for the AIA, I had emergency medicine, intensive care, anesthetists, nurses, hospital administrators coming together, spending hours with me to validate the guidance. And one of the doctors said to me, I am so delighted to contribute because I'm doing something else that can do good, that isn't a matter of facing the high stress of a patient. So we have an international network, we have an opportunity, and if you get in touch, I'm very happy to share the report that's just going to press now, and to talk further with this beautiful team of people who think not only about the disease and the virus, but the human and the social elements that can help us to conquer it and change environments that I think will bring society back into our places. So thank you.
Thank you, Eve. David, it's all up to you now.
Okay, thanks, Colin. I can now try to share my screen rapidly. Okay, is in?
Not seeing it yet. Here it comes. Yes.
Okay. Does it work? It's okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we're good. We can see it and we can hear you.
Perfect. Okay. Evidence-based design. After the very interesting introduction you developed now, I think we could conclude saying that the divide between biology and design, between biology and history of art, has to be overwhelmed absolutely and rapidly, because this is the time to bring back. I'm not saying this casually, sorry, but we have to bring back the merge between the biology, the science approach, and the science, and the design and the relationship with art. This is the first topic that we want to underline precisely. Second topic is related to the idea of a gated community. And when we think about the the enriched environments that is very important for the human brain and for the behavior, where normally we think about some particular areas inside cities and settlements. And we have to share this kind of enriched environment with all the other parts of the city. This is a mandatory action if you want to change something, because we cannot accept peacefully that we can continue to create a distinction, a strong and sharp distinction between the people that is living inside enriched environments and people that are living in completely different conditions. This is a sort of utopia, naturally, I know. But this is the time to dream, I think. Sometimes happens. I think we need to speak about also this. And third is, the third term is the void. Mainly designers are focused exclusively inside the buildings, the volumes. Probably now we have to come back and focusing the attention on the voids of the city. Voids is a place in which people met, and we hope we'll come back to meet in the next times, more frequently than now. And so we have to prepare the ground, able to create the proper interrelationship between the humans, as we know, because we know very well how much important is the terrain inside upon which people can bring out and create their relationship, able to strengthen their humanity, exactly their humanity. The fourth is the city's backyards. And city backyards are the areas outside cities that normally we name the countryside. The areas inside which mainly that we forgot almost completely as spaces strongly related to the cities, because the quality of the cities depends also by the quality of the backyards. And the agriculture, the quality of the food chains and the agro-industrial district and the ways through which we produce food are strongly important to define the landscape, the countryside landscapes. And so what we cannot continue to define our backyards, the countryside. And the last is this, because an old master of mine, a very old ecologist, a professor at the university, one time said to me that after a long analysis of a territory, if you decide at the end that you have to change nothing, it is also a design, because also this decision is a design. You have to conserve completely and to protect the richness of the biodiversity of a region for the simple reason that we know now very well that, for example, the virus and this virus, but probably also the next virus, could depend by the level of biodiversity that we can maintain or destroy inside the wild. So as a designer, we have to begin to study deeply and profoundly the features of the wild, of the nature, and recognizing that also protecting without changing nothing, protecting, living outside of our reach, these sections of the world. We are designing for the future. And I think this is the last point for me comment. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, David. So unless I've forgotten anybody, speak now or forever hold your peace. I don't think that I have. That concludes the second part of this webinar. The last part was to have been will be a general discussion among panelists. And David's idea, I already conveyed the themes to the panelists, but I'll pass along to the audience as well, that we identified 4 themes. Number 1, design inspired by brains. Number 2, reshape, transform. Number 3, interdependence, ecology. And number 4, inclusivity, equity. Officially, we only have about 10 minutes left in our session. And I know that some people have to leave at 1. I have to leave shortly after 1. So we should see if we can get the ball rolling with a bit of discussion on one or more of these themes. So if anybody would like to tackle any one of those 4 themes, Eve, go for it.
Okay, and given our short time, I'll make it short. I think the word is that it's all interconnected. Our brains are connected to our bodies, connected to our behavior, and connected to our environments. And the conceit that architecture or design is purely visual is too narrow, and is, as we think across all of our senses and reactions and responses, then we can achieve something that serves society better.
Thank you. So that I'm not sure if Susan is still here or not. I know she had to leave, but that sort of picks up on some of the things that Susan Maximum was saying, I think, about embodied cognition, and also Itai, who was talking about the illusion of that gap between person and world. Itai, do you have anything else you'd like to say about that?
I am saturated with ideas from all the great stuff. I think actually, the previous talk where I mentioned metacognition, and I was really happy that Sarah also mentioned it. There's a chicken and egg aspect of designing for better spaces, because it requires us understanding how we operate and how the world affects us. And for that, you need metacognition. I think as a effort from urbanists and from architects who are looking to understand how we create healthier environments, one of the best ways to do it is to increase people's spatial metacognition. So how do we use the city to help us think, help us relax, help us connect with others, help us even be productive if that's your thing. And so I think the role of what, a lot of us connects all of us in terms of science and architecture, and the intersection between it is, what can science tell us about ourselves and about how we can use our environment for ourselves? That should eventually lead to a better understanding of how we design spaces.
Thank you. Sarah.
I just want to say something about equity, which may have been lost, and is obviously a theme that we're all incredibly preoccupied with, and even more so in light of recent events, which is that if we do reframe what it is that architects and urban designers do in the ways that I think we're all saying, what I was actually explicitly addressing, the issue of design for social justice, of design for equity, takes care of itself, because you can't make the claim that certain people, just like you can't make the claim that it's okay for a certain set of mothers to have higher rates of infant mortality when they have their children than others. You can't make the claim that if the environment facilitates, fosters, nurtures, supports public health, then the design of the environment is something that everybody must have. So that's all.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Thank you for all these contributions. And as someone who is dealing in daily life in urban planning with a lot of citizens, my point or question in the round is, how can we do this not only on academical level, let's say, how can I bring all these good ideas in my really planning praxis in a way? I know they are, we have a lot of pilot projects, of course, also in my city, but how can we make it sure that there will be a kind of own responsibility in people acting or getting conscious of this? And I would be very happy if you can maybe sign something up or write me later on, because I really think cities, and Munich is not so a stressed city maybe as others, need this, but not only from top to down, but also really from the people itself. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So in Upali's language, how do we become, those of us who are academics, how do we become more pro-academic, I suppose? I think my response would be that it's only a little piece, but in part events like this are designed to mobilize the knowledge that we're collecting, bring it to the wider world, and help people to understand why these issues are so important and what can be done. I don't know. Upali?
I'd like to add to that, Colin, that I think we have to really step out of disciplinary arrogance, which has been in place for many, many years. And this constant mistrust between disciplines, this is my discipline, this is my area of expertise, you do not understand it, has not helped us get agency to make real change in the world. And this is a watershed moment. This is a moment where we have to put flawed ideas out there and be okay with people giving feedback and saying that works, that doesn't work, but I'm willing to test it. Like, we're on a petri dish. We're in this giant social experiment. We don't know where we're gonna come out on the other side, but shame on us if we don't learn. And it's been very, very interesting, because normally when you get credentials next to your name, you get very cautious about what you put out there. And during this time, I feel that it's really important to say, well, there's a lot of stuff that's being put out there. There's a lot of dialogue. Where is the dialogue around space and environments and the built environment? The data will very soon probably show that a majority of the incidents have been happening with these enclosed prisons we created for ourselves. The whole aerosolization debate will show that interior environments is where we brew disease. And suddenly we will become aware of sustainability because selfishly we don't want to die. It's just a really, really interesting moment where I feel that if we could just be a little more, I feel that those who protect evidence sometimes lack the empathy, and those who take the empathetic route are very suspicious of evidence. If we could find some way to bridge, and I love the idea of the manifest that came up earlier, like just everything I've heard on these couple of hours before. If we could make that and then just put ourselves up, like I'm willing to say that I would put some of our projects up as test beds. We can experiment, maybe we'll fail, maybe here's a thought we will share when we fail. That could be something. Okay, sorry, that was a long response.
That was great, thank you. Elizabeth, did I see your hand up? Elizabeth, I thought I saw it. No? Okay.
I just want to, can I add something? Oh, Susan, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that as I listen, we as professionals, I think, are being more vulnerable and listening better, listening, not holding turf, but listening better. And I think that's super important, because that's really how we learn. I wonder if there's a place for public communications, like beginning to start to message out to different communities things that they can do now, things they can do for themselves immediately. So if, you know, someone was talking about top down, and I think there's sort of side in and bottom up, but what if we were able to really get agency, that was, somebody used that word, I love that word, agency, to people who could say something as simple as, you know, go outside and dance, you know, in the street, or think about, you know, what you can do with lights, or just really simple, basic things that start to give people agency and change, so that they know what it feels like. And I think once you know what it feels like, you want it more, right? So I think less theoretical and more practical, but at a person-to-person level. And I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you. Itai, you had a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about the way architecture is produced in the architecture profession. The fact that we don't have a continuing long-term relationships with projects, meaning we go through a process and we end up with a final product, is one of, in my opinion, the friction that's created between architecture as a profession and its inability to adopt the humility of science, of understanding how do we change our thesis, how do we adapt according to feedback. If on a very practical level, architects were able to continue the relationship with space, we would end up with the ability to readjust that thesis and learn in the way that science learns, to correct ourselves. As it stands, currently architects and designers have one chance to come up with the ultimate design that will stay there, you know, permanently, and everyone has to live with. So it's really this, the profession's relationship with architecture that I think is one of the mechanisms we need to address.
Thank you. Eve?
Yes, and I put in the chat, but I think this is a very inspired conversation, and this is the right group of people to begin it. And I volunteered the Clinicians for Design group to, along with your institutions, to see how we can actually host a platform for a voice. So I'm very happy to continue that conversation. Davide, you've created a wonderful thing here, and I see no reason why we couldn't respond to Elizabeth's and everyone else's comments and use this platform.
Great, thank you.
If I can add some, I was saying at the beginning that tomorrow, for example, the European community is going to discuss the huge plan for the recovery funds, and we need to focus also these issues if we want to understand in which way we can transform. We could transform the words we mentioned during the presentations in something closer to the reality. And this is the one first. To convince and to bring with us the decision maker, we need to define methods, methods of measurements of outcomes of our proposals, and an approach that can be used to confirm, and I would say also scientifically, that we must say also scientifically, the reason for which the health is strongly linked to the shape and the form of the urban environment, of the countryside, and of the natural world. The interconnections among these elements are very clear now, and we have to think as designer about all these different areas, not simply to the urban, not simply to the volumes, not simply to the voids, but about everything inside this play. And money, but also we have to push in trying to define the way to use money, because they are public money, and so they are the next debt of the future generation. And so we want to invest in a proper way the resources we need to at least try to define the traits along which and through which to use the resources, financial resources. And this is an attempt that naturally it seems too big for architects, too big. But if we think about us as not simply designer, but as a scientist, designer, thinker, if we see ourselves as citizens, we need to at least attempt to do it. We have to write something together, I think. Because naturally, it seems to me, and maybe it's clear now, that my idea was to find a moment at which gather around the table many thinkers able to write something, able to suggest to the right people, to the decision maker, some lines of development about cities, countryside, and natural worlds, about all the conditions. I'd like to do it. I don't know. I don't know what you think about. I'd like the idea. What do you think about this strange idea to write something together?
I personally think this is a very good idea, and I take example from the letter to the WHO that has changed our conversation about aerosolization. And rather than a huge task for one or two people, we have many people who have, just as evidenced in our presentations in 5 minutes, deep expertise in multiple areas. And so we can not only craft our topics and paragraphs and bring them together, but then have a paper that is signed by many, many, many experts. And that adds such credibility and gravitas to an effort. So that's one idea about how perhaps to effect it quickly, because time is the essence.
May I say something?
Yes. Of course.
So about the idea of Davide, of course, it could be very interesting to write all together with this cultural diversity that we were exposing today. I have some doubt about the usefulness of measure, and because really the problem is not measuring. The problem, we are full of we have billions of data, scientific data. We have thousands of different methodologies to measure the reality, to measure the quality, to measure everything, and also the unsustainability. The problem is that we are not able to narrate it to people. The problem is narration. The problem is how we translate to the people down the street the problem of global warming, the problem of inequity. The city is not the product of urban. I am an architect and urban planner, but I stopped my work in the reality because we are not building the city. We are giving some technical responses to the people who is shaping our life, who is shaping our economy that is totally wrong. We're shaping our behaviors of in wasting, in consumption, and so the city is the result of this system. And for this reason, I think that it's all the aspects we were speaking today are very important for our lives, but we forget that sometimes we are living in a too opulent world. The people which is involved in this seminar, And this is not the reality. Richard Sennett was speaking about the difference between middle class and smart working, and this is smart working for us, and working class. And this is the reality. And so it's very difficult to create a more equal, a more solid city if we don't change our mind, if we don't narrate another reality. So it's important to create very good projects. It's important processes, and how we another aspect that Richard Sennett was pointing in a very important way was the mistake of the smart city paradigm, and it is totally top down. And not for us, but many architects or planners are totally top down, and also the ecologists, also people working in sustainability is totally top down, thinking that indicators, numbers, and measurements are useful to change the reality. It's a mess. We have to narrate. We have to create novels. We have to create something that is useful for our how Susan was explaining very well. We feel before we think, and we don't pay attention to this aspect. When Gregory Bateson was speaking about the purposive thinking, we always are thinking how to change, and but we don't think that humans are feeling before thinking. So that's all.
Thank you. Any last parting remarks before we call it a day or a night?
Yeah, maybe one last one. I really think it's a good idea to co-create another manifesto. We have from the Center for Conscious Design is based on the Conscious Cities Manifesto, and I've always wondered how that can be extended into something that can be co-created. So first of all, that's an offer out to all of you. Secondly, I think one of the biggest obstacles that we have is how to create a system that can last beyond our paradigm and beyond the way that we see the world. Architecture and urban design is filled with examples of people who feel that they had the ultimate approach to create a utopia, and we understand that each time it's a mistake after again and again. How can we stop this cycle by creating a manifesto that that is paradigm free enough and focused enough on the human experience to evolve with us over time and not be this transcribed vision from the past?
Thank you.
And perhaps our manifesto, as Davide started, is with a manifesto of flexible design, to think beyond the one solution.
See, I think
yes, the idea of flexible design is very important.
Very well. And if you want to start making this next step, maybe keeping in mind number 3, before to organize the third part of this step, this path, probably we have to circulate some things, or to create probably a group meeting inside, reserved meeting, secret meeting, a secret meeting. No, I'm joking a little bit. At the end of the afternoon, and we need to create we need to prepare the third step, probably in organizing a meeting inside the group. And September, October, we could, or November also, we could prepare the third step in order to share with the people, with you that are listening, participating to our conference, the results, and a result that can naturally be criticized strongly because we need to involve the narrative. In the narrative, we need to involve from bottom up a lot of people because we need you naturally. And if you agree, we can conclude at this point. We have a lot of work to do, but we have the shoulder sufficiently big, I think, to support also this effort. Janji is smiling because we are very...
Especially Colin. Colin has a big shoulder.
Well, very well, very well. Now I can. I would like to update this meeting between us in September, if you agree, in preparing the November. I'm tracking a sort of timing. If you agree, let me know if you agree. We can organize in November the third part. What do you think? Is feasible? Is it feasible from your side?
Davide, do you know what's happening in the world in September? I'm kidding, of course.
September? What's going to happen in September?
Nobody knows.
No, you have to foresee in the future if you want to make something.
I'm all in.
You have to envision the future.
Certainly this is feasible because we don't know what's happening now, but we can still come together and look for progress. But the question is the dates, the specific dates. And Davide, did you say November or September?
And I was thinking to organize inside between us. September a Zoom conference in order to circulate the first draft of a manifesto, and in order to share with everybody in November or late October, probably better in November, the conclusion, because probably it will be a very, very, very huge and very difficult elaboration, and we have not only this to do. so probably we need to think in a very deep way about this. This is my opinion, naturally, my simple opinion.
I suppose, yes, to create a fully written manifesto will take a good amount of time. And I wonder if there are steps on the way towards a manifesto, so shorter messages, because our world is changing so quickly and dramatically. And what I'm seeing is that although many countries have conquered the beast, it's starting to resurge again in many locations as people open up and partake in unsafe behaviors. So perhaps we can think about designing an in-house series of steps towards the manifesto in a shorter time frame, so that we're not just waiting for the production of the full manifesto.
Well, we can circulate among us some proposals about the timing, about the way to produce it, and finding a synthesis at the end. During August, maybe we can find the first synthesis about the method, timing, and so later in September, if the word will exist.
Davide, may I ask? Do you think that you, the organizers, you will share in the next 2 weeks at least a sort of very synthetic and rough report over these 2 webinars, and over the contents and what we were speaking about, etc. But in a very quickly way. In this way, all of us we can try to write some ideas, some suggestions, sending to you probably before September, and then in September we could start to work on just having something on the paper.
Yeah, because probably next week or 2 weeks, the recordings of the afternoon will be shared as the first we done already. We already done this, the sharing of the first. And so the video is available, but also the synthesis, the writing about the synthesis of the contents we are presenting. We presented this afternoon will be surely set up.
That could be very useful.
I'm sure. No, and naturally, this is the next step we have to do, sharing the contents that we presented this afternoon. Mm-hmm.
And with the pleasure of being restricted to 5 minutes, that's so much easier for each of us to write up if it needs to be in a written form.
Well,
you know, can I tell you an experience? In 2009, the World Bank paid me a flight to Brazil just to speak about local development, and they paid me the first class travel and then 5 stars hotel, etc. And I arrived with 70 slides, 70. And they told me in Brazil, you have to speak 12 minutes. 12 minutes for an academic guy is nothing. And I was speaking 11 minutes, and I discovered that it's possible. 5 minutes is a lot of time.
I had a similar experience when I was asked to speak in China, and I expected a 1-hour presentation, and in the car on the way from the hotel where they put me up to the conference center, they said, no, sorry, it's 20 minutes. So in the car on my laptop.
It's a nightmare. For us, it's a nightmare.
very
But we achieved.
Thanks a lot to everybody. I think that we are going to conclude this afternoon, and it has been a very interesting moment for me, because I perceive a feeling, inside myself that I didn't perceive since a long time. And thanks a lot. And I hope to see. No, we have to see. We have to organize. We have to organize a meeting soon when we'll be ready to do it. Thanks to everybody. Colin,
that's good.
You have been great. Absolutely.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you all
for your effort.
Thanks everyone. Great work.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Davide. Thank you to everybody.
Stay safe.
Thank you all. Take care.
Sure.
And keep in touch.
Ciao. Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao. Ciao.
Bye-bye.